The rain had started before Daniel Mercer reached the gates of his house. It was nearly midnight, and the neighborhood looked abandoned beneath the streetlights. Daniel had expected the familiar comfort of silence. His business trip had been scheduled to last another 2 days, but the meeting in Chicago had been canceled without warning. The airline had found him a late flight home, and Daniel had decided not to tell Elena. He wanted to surprise her. The house was illuminated from inside. Daniel noticed it immediately. The study light was on, along with several lamps downstairs. Through the rain-streaked windshield, he could see shadows moving behind the curtains. Elena was supposed to be asleep. He carried his suitcase through the front door and called her name. "Lena?" No answer. Daniel set his suitcase beside the staircase. Then he heard laughter. It came from the private study. Perhaps Elena had invited a friend over. Perhaps he was simply tired. Then he heard a man's voice. His brother's voice. Daniel knew it instantly. Jonathan. Older by 6 years, Jonathan Mercer had always been the person Daniel trusted above everyone else. When their father died, Jonathan became the steady presence in the family. He had helped Daniel through university, found him his first serious job, and stood beside him when Daniel married Elena. Jonathan was a judge now, respected across the city for his sharp mind and calm authority. People trusted him because he seemed incapable of losing control. Daniel slowly walked toward the study. The door was almost closed. He pushed it open. Everything inside him stopped. Elena stood beside the desk, her face pale, her hair disheveled. Jonathan was there too. His jacket lay across a chair. 2 glasses stood on the desk. Daniel looked at Elena, then at his brother, then back at Elena. The silence was worse than any confession. Daniel's eyes fell to Elena's wedding ring. It was sitting on the desk beside Jonathan's watch. His breathing became shallow. "How long?" he finally asked. Elena opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Jonathan stepped forward. "Daniel, listen to me." Daniel raised one hand. Jonathan stopped. The man Daniel had trusted for most of his life suddenly looked like a stranger wearing his brother's face. "You?" Daniel whispered. "It was you?" Elena began crying. Jonathan's voice remained controlled. "You need to calm down." Daniel almost laughed. Calm down. That was what judges said when emotion threatened to overwhelm a room. That was what Jonathan had always said whenever Daniel lost his temper. Daniel stepped backward. He did not shout. He did not strike anyone. He did not demand another explanation. He simply turned and walked out of the study. Behind him, Elena called his name. Daniel kept walking. He passed the family photographs lining the hallway, photographs filled with birthdays, holidays, weddings, and smiling faces. At the front door, he stopped. For 1 second, he looked back. Then he walked into the rain. By the time Daniel reached his car, he understood that the woman he loved and the brother he worshipped had become part of the same secret. And for the first time in his life, he wondered what a man becomes when the 2 people he trusted most are suddenly the 2 people he can trust least. The story moves backward, away from the courtroom and the questions surrounding Daniel, to a time when Jonathan's name carried a very different meaning. Long before suspicion entered the family, Jonathan was one of the most respected men in this city. He was known for his sharp mind, measured decisions, and unusual discipline. Colleagues admired the way he handled difficult cases without allowing anger, pressure, or personal relationships to influence his judgment. Outside the courthouse, his reputation was equally impressive. He donated to local charities, helped struggling families, and quietly supported young students who dreamed of studying law. To most people, Jonathan represented everything a judge was supposed to be. To Daniel, however, Jonathan had always been more than a respected judge. He had been his older brother, his protector, and, for much of their childhood, the person Daniel believed could solve almost any problem. When their parents struggled financially, Jonathan found ways to help. When Daniel failed at something, Jonathan was the first person to tell him that failure did not have to become his identity. He taught Daniel how to speak confidently, how to recognize opportunities, and how to approach influential people without appearing desperate. As the brothers grew older, their paths began separating. Jonathan became increasingly successful, while Daniel struggled to establish an identity that did not depend on his brother's achievements. People introduced Daniel as Jonathan's younger brother before asking what Daniel himself had accomplished. At first, Daniel accepted it as a compliment. Eventually, it became a quiet source of resentment. Still, Jonathan never appeared to notice. When Daniel met Elena, Jonathan encouraged the relationship. He told Daniel that Elena was intelligent, ambitious, and loyal, and that a man should not hesitate when he found someone who believed in him. Daniel listened. Their marriage followed soon afterward. In those early years, Elena was different from the woman Daniel would later remember. She laughed easily. She talked about her plans with confidence and expected Daniel to share his own dreams. She wanted to build a life that belonged to both of them, not simply follow whatever career demanded his attention. For a while, they did exactly that. Then Daniel's work began consuming him. One late meeting became several. A weekend at home became an interruption between phone calls. Dinner conversations became shorter, and Elena gradually stopped asking when he would be free because she already knew the answer. Daniel did not consider himself neglectful. He believed he was working for their future. There were signs Daniel dismissed because one seemed harmless. Elena began mentioning Jonathan's opinions during conversations. She would say Jonathan believed a decision was sensible, or that he had recommended someone for a problem Daniel had not heard about. Daniel rarely questioned her. He was too tired, too busy, and too convinced that trust meant refusing to look for trouble where none had been proven. Meanwhile, Jonathan remained composed. In public, he treated Daniel with the affection he had. He praised his brother's work and spoke proudly about Daniel whenever others were listening. That made Daniel's uneasiness harder to explain. He could not accuse Jonathan without sounding paranoid. He could not accuse Elena without admitting how little he had been present in his own marriage. So he chose the easiest explanation: stress. But stress did not explain why Elena sometimes looked at Jonathan before answering. It did not explain why Jonathan seemed to know when she was unhappy. And it certainly did not explain why Daniel felt like a guest in his own home. That was when Jonathan began appearing more often. At first, there was nothing unusual about it. He joined family dinners, offered Daniel advice about professional decisions, and occasionally stopped by when he was nearby. When Elena had questions about a legal matter, Jonathan explained everything patiently. Daniel appreciated the help. But over time, something changed. Jonathan started visiting even when Daniel was not home. He would remain in the living room talking with Elena until Daniel returned. Their conversations were never openly inappropriate, yet Daniel noticed that they seemed to share references and private jokes he did not understand. Elena would sometimes stop speaking when Daniel entered the room, as though a conversation had ended before he arrived. Daniel told himself he was imagining things. Then small moments began collecting in his memory. One evening, Daniel complained that Elena had been distant lately. Before Elena could answer, Jonathan defended her. "She has been carrying more than you realize," he said calmly. Daniel stared at him. "You seem to know a lot about what she is carrying." Jonathan did not react. "I know what people look like when they feel ignored." The words stayed with Daniel. After that, he began watching more carefully. Elena became noticeably quieter whenever Jonathan's name came up. If Daniel criticized his brother, she sometimes defended him. If Jonathan praised Elena's judgment, Daniel felt an uncomfortable sting that he could not explain. The worst part was not jealousy. It was the growing realization that Jonathan seemed to understand Elena in ways Daniel no longer did. Daniel began remembering conversations from years earlier, moments when Jonathan had advised him to listen more carefully to his wife. At the time, the advice had sounded brotherly. Now it seemed different. One night, after Daniel and Jonathan had argued about a minor family matter, Jonathan looked at him with an expression Daniel could never forget. There was no anger in his face, only a strange calmness. "You should never assume you know everything about the person sleeping beside you." Daniel had laughed then, pretending the statement meant nothing. Years later, he would remember every word. Because what sounded like advice had never really been advice at all. It had been a warning, a confession, or perhaps a challenge. Daniel simply had not understood which one. And as the story moves forward again, the question becomes impossible to ignore. What exactly had Jonathan known about Elena? And how long had he known it? The question of what Jonathan had known becomes more disturbing when the story moves forward into the months before everything finally broke apart. By then, the distance inside Daniel and Elena's marriage was no longer something either of them could pretend not to notice. Elena had become emotionally isolated. Daniel was present in the house, but his presence often felt like supervision rather than companionship. He asked where she had been, who she had spoken to, and why she needed certain things without explaining why the answers mattered so much. His jealousy had started as insecurity, but over time it became controlling behavior. Elena felt watched whenever she used her phone, stayed late somewhere, or changed her plans. Yet Elena was not completely innocent. She knew Daniel was suspicious, and instead of confronting the problems directly, she sometimes avoided difficult conversations. She kept certain feelings to herself. When Daniel demanded explanations, she occasionally gave incomplete answers simply because telling him everything seemed exhausting. The more they avoided each other honestly, the easier it became for resentment to grow between them. Jonathan noticed. He had always been observant, but now his attention toward Elena became deliberate. He never rushed. He understood that someone who felt trapped rarely trusted the first person who offered an escape. Instead, he presented himself as someone who simply wanted to understand. When Elena complained about Daniel, Jonathan listened. He did not immediately criticize his brother. That would have made his intentions obvious. Instead, he asked quiet questions. Did Daniel still listen to her? Did he respect her decisions? Did Elena feel valued in her own home? Those questions stayed with her. Jonathan began telling Elena that she deserved to be treated with dignity. He reminded her that being married did not mean surrendering her voice. He praised her intelligence and told her that Daniel's inability to recognize it was his failure, not hers. At first, Elena resisted. She defended Daniel. She explained that he was under pressure and that his behavior came from fear of losing their marriage. Jonathan accepted her explanation without argument. Then, he would say something simple. "Maybe, but that does not mean you have to be unhappy." That sentence became a doorway. Their conversations became longer. A few minutes became half an hour, then an hour. They talked about Daniel, but eventually they talked about Elena's ambitions, disappointments, childhood memories, and fears. Jonathan remembered details she had mentioned weeks earlier. That attention made Elena feel important. It also made her vulnerable. Jonathan understood that emotional closeness could cross boundaries without either person admitting that a boundary had been crossed. He tested those limits carefully. A compliment became personal. A private conversation became a secret. A secret became something Elena felt she could not explain to Daniel. Jonathan never needed to say that he wanted her. He allowed Elena to reach that conclusion herself. Meanwhile, Daniel was becoming increasingly suspicious. He noticed phone calls that ended whenever he entered the room. He noticed passwords changing and Elena becoming protective of her phone. Sometimes she would leave the room to answer a message, then return with an expression he could not read. Daniel assumed there was another man. That suspicion changed the way he behaved. He questioned Elena more frequently and watched her reactions. Every hesitation became evidence. Every unexplained absence became another piece of a story he was building in his mind. But Daniel never considered Jonathan. How could he? Jonathan was the brother who had protected him as a child, helped him professionally, supported his marriage, and repeatedly told him to trust the woman he loved. Jonathan had positioned himself as the safest person in Daniel's world. That was precisely why Daniel could not see the danger. For Elena, the situation was becoming harder to define. She knew something had changed between her and Jonathan, but she did not want to name it. Naming it would mean accepting responsibility for choices she had not yet admitted making. Jonathan made that easier. He told her that feelings were not crimes. He told her that needing someone did not make her weak. Most importantly, he convinced her that the connection between them was not the problem. The problem, he suggested, was a marriage that had already stopped giving her the freedom to be herself. Gradually, Elena began seeing the affair as an escape rather than a betrayal. That was Jonathan's greatest success. He had not simply pursued her. He had helped reshape the story she told herself until crossing the final boundary felt almost inevitable. Then, one evening, Elena's phone lit up while Daniel was sitting nearby. She glanced at the screen. Jonathan's name appeared. The message was brief. "Come to the study tonight. We need to decide what happens next." Elena stared at it for several seconds. Then she deleted the message. But deletion could not erase what Daniel had already seen. He did not know the words. He did not know who had sent them. He only saw Elena's expression change, and for the first time, the possibility he had feared began pointing toward a person he had never suspected. Daniel waited for an answer, but Elena turned the phone face down and walked toward the kitchen. He followed, asking again, this time without raising his voice. Her silence frightened him more than an argument would have. He wanted a name, an explanation, anything that could make the feeling disappear. Instead, Elena asked why he always assumed the worst. The question shifted the conversation back onto him, exactly as Jonathan had taught her to do without ever saying so directly. Daniel did not realize that yet. He only knew that something had changed, and whatever had changed was no longer hidden as carefully as before. His trust in Jonathan finally began to crack tonight. Daniel looked at her. "Elena," he said quietly. "Who was that?" She said nothing. And somewhere in the house, behind a closed door, the next decision was already waiting. The silence that followed Elena's refusal to answer did more than confirm Daniel's suspicions. It changed the way he looked at everything around him. The unanswered question stayed with him through dinner, through the long hours of the night, and into the following morning. Yet Daniel made one decision that surprised even himself. He would not confront her. Not yet. If Elena was hiding something, Daniel wanted to know exactly what it was before he demanded an explanation. He began watching quietly, paying attention to details he had previously ignored. He noticed when she left the room to make calls. He noticed which evenings she suddenly had reasons to be away. He noticed how often Jonathan's name appeared in conversations that seemed unrelated to him. Daniel also started watching Jonathan. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Jonathan continued attending court, meeting colleagues, and maintaining the polished public image that had made him so respected. He spoke confidently, dressed carefully, and behaved as though nothing in his personal life could possibly be questioned. But Daniel knew his brother too well. He began checking the explanations Jonathan gave for certain evenings. One night, Jonathan claimed he had been working late at the courthouse. Daniel casually mentioned the courthouse the next day, and discovered that Jonathan had left hours earlier. Another evening, Jonathan said he had attended a charity meeting. Daniel later learned that the meeting had ended before Jonathan claimed to have arrived. None of the lies alone proved anything. Together, they became difficult to ignore. Daniel then discovered that Elena had met Jonathan privately several times. The meetings were not random. They occurred on evenings when Daniel was working late or believed Elena was visiting someone else. Sometimes they lasted less than an hour. Other times, Elena remained away much longer. Daniel felt anger rising inside him, but beneath the anger was something colder. Fear. He had expected to find another man. He had not expected that man to be his brother. The deeper Daniel investigated, the more disturbing Jonathan became. Daniel began searching through old conversations and quietly asking people about his brother. Former colleagues did not accuse Jonathan of anything illegal, but several described the same unsettling quality. Jonathan was charming, patient, and unusually good at understanding people. He seemed to know exactly what someone feared losing: a position, a reputation, a marriage, a secret. Then, somehow, he would use that knowledge to influence them. One former colleague remembered Jonathan saying that people rarely changed because of what they wanted. They changed because of what they were afraid to lose. Daniel could not stop thinking about that sentence. Meanwhile, Elena's relationship with Jonathan was becoming more complicated than a simple affair. She had begun depending on him emotionally. Whenever she felt frightened, angry, or confused, she contacted Jonathan. Whenever Daniel questioned her, she sought Jonathan's advice. He gradually became the person she trusted to interpret Daniel's behavior. That dependence gave Jonathan enormous power. He started warning Elena about Daniel. At first, the warnings sounded reasonable. Jonathan told her that Daniel's jealousy was becoming dangerous. He said that a man who felt betrayed could lose control. He warned Elena that if Daniel discovered the truth, the consequences could become unpredictable. Elena was frightened. Then Jonathan offered reassurance. He told her that he would protect her. That was the contradiction Daniel eventually understood. Jonathan was telling Elena that Daniel was becoming a threat, while simultaneously making himself indispensable as her protection from that threat. Every warning increased her fear, and every fear pushed her closer to Jonathan. The more afraid Elena became, the more she needed him. And the more she needed him, the less capable she became of seeing what was happening. Jonathan never had to order her to stay. He only had to convince her that leaving him would make everything worse. Daniel slowly realized that this was not simply an affair. It was manipulation. And realizing that made his anger toward Elena more complicated. He could not completely excuse her choices, because she had made them. But he also began wondering how much of what she believed had been planted there by Jonathan. Then Daniel found the evidence. It was not dramatic. There was no confession waiting on a screen or photograph that explained everything. It was something much smaller, something Jonathan had overlooked because he believed Daniel would never look closely enough. A message, a date, a location. 3 details that, together, removed the last remaining doubt. Daniel stared at the evidence for several minutes. His hands were steady, but his thoughts were not. He could confront Elena immediately. He could call Jonathan. He could expose everything. But another thought stopped him. If Jonathan had manipulated Elena this carefully, then confronting him without understanding the full situation might give him another opportunity to control the story. Daniel wanted to know what Jonathan planned next. He wanted to see how far his brother was willing to go. So Daniel made a decision he would later regret. He would say nothing. Instead, he would watch them. That evening, Daniel told Elena he would be working late. He left the house as expected. But he did not remain away. Several hours later, he returned home earlier than anyone anticipated. The house was quiet when he entered. He stood inside the doorway listening. Then he noticed a light beneath the study door. Daniel moved toward it slowly. For the first time, he understood that whatever he was about to discover might permanently change his family. He reached for the doorknob. And before he opened the door, he heard Jonathan's voice from inside. Daniel opened the study door and found the answer he had been dreading standing directly in front of him. For several seconds, nobody moved. Jonathan stood near the desk, his expression changing from confidence to calculation. Elena was beside him, pale and frozen, as though the room had suddenly become too small for either of them to breathe. Daniel looked from one face to the other. Then his eyes moved across the room. Jonathan's watch was lying on the desk. Beside it was Elena's wedding ring. Behind them, hanging on the wall, was a family photograph taken years earlier. Daniel remembered that day clearly. Their parents had still been alive. The brothers had stood together, smiling for the camera, while Elena had stood beside Daniel with one hand resting against his shoulder. The photograph made the scene feel impossible. This was not some stranger's house. This was his home. His marriage. His brother. Jonathan recovered first. "Daniel," he said carefully, "this is not what you think." Daniel almost smiled. He had heard those words before in movies, in arguments, in stories told by people who had already been caught. He had never imagined hearing them from Jonathan. Elena began crying. Daniel looked at her, waiting for an explanation, but she could not meet his eyes. Jonathan stepped forward. "Listen to me. There are things you don't understand." Daniel raised one hand. The gesture stopped him. "How long?" His voice was quiet. That frightened Elena more than shouting would have. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Daniel waited. "How long?" Elena lowered her head. Jonathan finally answered. "Months." The word seemed to remove whatever remained between suspicion and reality. "Months." Daniel repeated it silently. Months of dinners. Months of excuses. Months of changed passwords, private conversations, unexplained absences, and moments when Elena had looked at Jonathan in ways Daniel had refused to understand. All those memories suddenly rearranged themselves. He began laughing. At first, it was only a short, broken sound. Then it grew louder. Elena looked frightened. Jonathan watched him carefully, unable to decide whether Daniel had lost control or was about to regain it. Daniel kept laughing. He laughed at himself. At his trust. At every time he had defended Jonathan. At every time he had blamed himself for becoming suspicious. At every night he had worked late believing he was protecting his marriage while his brother had been quietly stepping into it. Then, without warning, the laughter stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than anything Daniel could have said. Jonathan took another cautious step toward him. "Daniel, don't do anything reckless." Daniel looked directly at his brother. For a moment, Jonathan seemed to expect anger. Instead, Daniel's face became strangely calm. "You taught me my whole life that family comes first." Jonathan said nothing. Daniel turned toward Elena. "I just didn't know I was the thing you were willing to sacrifice." Elena covered her face. Daniel did not move toward her. He did not demand an explanation. He did not ask why. Some questions had already been answered by the room itself. He turned and walked toward the door. Jonathan followed him with his eyes. "Daniel, wait!" Daniel stopped for half a second. He looked back, but not at Jonathan. He looked at the photograph. The family in that picture had believed they understood what loyalty meant. Daniel wondered how many lies could exist inside a single happy photograph. Then he walked out. He crossed the hallway without saying another word. His footsteps sounded strangely loud against the quiet floor. Elena remained in the study, crying softly, while Jonathan stood beside her, watching the doorway through which his brother had disappeared. Daniel reached the front door. His hand touched the handle. Behind him, he heard movement. He turned slightly. Jonathan had leaned toward Elena. His voice was too quiet for Daniel to hear clearly. But Daniel saw Elena's expression change. Her tears stopped. Her eyes widened. Whatever Jonathan whispered, it did not sound like comfort. Daniel stared at them for one long moment before leaving the house. Outside, the night air felt colder than it should have. He walked toward his car without knowing where he intended to go. His mind moved between rage, disbelief, humiliation, and a terrible emptiness. The person he had trusted most had betrayed him, and the person he had promised to protect had chosen to keep a secret from him. Yet one detail would not leave his thoughts. Jonathan's whisper. Daniel had not heard the words, but he had seen Elena's reaction. That reaction told him the conversation was not finished. Inside the house, Jonathan returned to the study and closed the door. Elena remained standing beside the desk. "What are we going to do?" she asked through tears. Jonathan looked toward the window. "We do exactly what we planned." Elena shook her head. "Daniel knows." "I know." "What if he tells everyone?" Jonathan turned toward her. "He won't." His certainty disturbed her. "How can you be so sure?" Jonathan said nothing for several seconds. Then he reminded her of something she had almost forgotten. Daniel had always been desperate to protect the family's reputation. He would not want their parents' memory destroyed. He would not want the city to know. Most importantly, Jonathan said, Daniel still needed to believe that he could control what happened next. Elena looked uncertain. Jonathan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "That is why you cannot tell him everything." Those words settled heavily between them. Outside, Daniel sat alone in his car. He still did not know what Jonathan had whispered. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The affair was no longer the worst thing his brother had hidden from him. And tomorrow, Daniel would begin searching for the secret that Jonathan was more desperate to protect. Because if Jonathan was willing to destroy his marriage, manipulate Elena, and lie to his own brother, Daniel knew there had to be something more hidden. The night did not end when Daniel walked out of the house. It only became quieter. For several hours, nobody knew where he had gone. Elena remained in the study, sitting with her hands clasped together, unable to decide whether she should call him or wait. Every few minutes she looked toward the door, expecting Daniel to return. Jonathan told Elena that Daniel was unstable. "He has been under pressure for months," Jonathan said. "You saw how he reacted." Elena looked at him through tearful eyes. "You knew this could happen." Jonathan avoided the accusation. "We have to protect ourselves now." Protect ourselves. Until that moment, Elena had still imagined that Jonathan's confidence meant he had a plan. Now she began wondering whether the plan had ever been about helping her. Jonathan continued speaking, carefully shaping the story he wanted her to believe. Daniel had become jealous. Daniel had become controlling. Daniel had entered the study looking for a confrontation. Jonathan had tried to calm him down. Elena listened, but something inside her resisted. She remembered the warnings Jonathan had given her. Daniel will hurt you. Daniel will destroy you. Daniel will never let you leave. Those warnings had once made Jonathan seem like her protector. Now they sounded strangely convenient. Then the front door opened. Elena froze. Jonathan turned toward the hallway. Daniel had returned. He entered the room slowly. His face was exhausted, but his voice was steady. "Why?" Jonathan watched him carefully. Daniel took another step. "Why did you do this?" Jonathan said nothing. Daniel's eyes moved toward Elena, then back to his brother. "After everything I did for you, why?" Jonathan finally answered. "Because Elena came to me." The sentence landed heavily. She was unhappy, Jonathan continued. She told me what the marriage had become. I listened. Daniel stared at him. You listened? Yes. And then you took my wife. Jonathan's expression hardened. I didn't take anyone. Elena made her own choices. Elena closed her eyes. Daniel looked at her. Is that true? Elena struggled to answer. I thought about leaving you. Daniel's face changed. The admission hurt, but it was not the part that shocked him most. I wanted to leave, she continued. I told Jonathan I didn't know how. Daniel waited. He said he could help me. Jonathan immediately interrupted. That is not what I said. Elena looked at him. You said you would help me escape. I said I would help you make a decision. You told me Daniel would never let me go. Jonathan shook his head. You were afraid. I was trying to protect you. Elena's voice became stronger. No. You were telling me what to fear. The room fell silent. Daniel looked between them. Suddenly, pieces that had never made sense began fitting together. Jonathan had warned Elena about Daniel. Jonathan had told Daniel that Elena was unhappy. Jonathan had convinced each of them that the other was the source of the danger. And now both were standing in front of him with completely different versions of the same story. Daniel looked at his brother. You lied to both of us. Jonathan did not answer. Daniel's anger returned, but this time it was mixed with something deeper. The realization that his brother had deliberately created the confusion that had destroyed the family. Jonathan told him to calm down. Daniel stepped forward. The argument became louder. Elena moved between them, pleading for them to stop. Jonathan accused Daniel of threatening him. Daniel demanded that Jonathan admit what he had done. Neither man listened. A chair moved. Something struck the edge of the desk. A glass object fell and shattered across the floor. Elena screamed. The next moments became confused and frightening. There was shouting, movement, and the sound of something breaking. Daniel remembered reaching toward Elena, but he could not later remember exactly how everything had happened. Then, suddenly, the room became silent. Daniel stood completely still. He looked toward Elena. She was motionless. For a moment, his mind refused to understand what he was seeing. Lena? There was no answer. Jonathan was gone. Daniel looked toward the open doorway. Jonathan? Nothing. Daniel moved toward Elena and dropped beside her. He tried to understand what had happened, but his thoughts were breaking apart. He kept repeating her name, as though saying it could somehow bring the previous hour back. It could not. When the police arrived, they found Daniel alone in the study. He simply sat there, staring at his hands as though they belonged to someone else. The officers asked him what had happened. Daniel looked up slowly. His voice was barely audible. I didn't mean to kill her. The words hung in the room. But the investigators noticed something Daniel did not. There was no sign of Jonathan. No explanation for where he had gone. And no immediate answer to the question that would soon dominate the entire investigation. If Daniel had been left alone with Elena after the confrontation, why had Jonathan disappeared before the police arrived? By morning, the story would begin changing. Daniel would be called a jealous husband. Elena would be remembered as the victim. And Jonathan, the respected judge, would appear to be the grieving brother who had escaped a dangerous confrontation. But one detail from that night refused to disappear. Jonathan had whispered something to Elena before Daniel left. Whatever those words were, they had started a chain of events that ended with Elena dead and Daniel accused. And somewhere beyond the reach of the house, Jonathan was already preparing to tell his version first. Because whoever controls the first story often controls what everyone believes afterward. Daniel did not know that yet. He only knew that his wife was gone, his brother had vanished, and his entire life had become a question he could no longer answer. Daniel could not understand that the truth was more complicated than guilt, betrayal, or anger, and that Jonathan had planned beyond tonight. The next morning, detectives would begin asking questions. And the first question would not be about the affair. It would be about what Jonathan had been hiding before either of them ever entered that study. The next morning, the investigation changed direction when Detective Mara Ellis took control of the case. She arrived at the house before sunrise, carrying a notebook and the calm expression of someone who had learned that the first story was rarely the whole story. Daniel was still there. He looked exhausted, confused, and emotionally shattered. His answers were short. He admitted arguing with Jonathan and Elena, but whenever Mara asked him to describe the final moments before Elena died, he became strangely hesitant. "He left," Daniel repeated. "Jonathan left before she died." Mara watched him carefully. "When exactly?" Daniel struggled to answer. "I don't know." "What did he say?" "I don't remember." "Where did he go?" "I don't know." The repeated uncertainty did not make Daniel look innocent. It made him look like someone protecting a secret. Mara did not accuse him. She simply wrote everything down. Across town, Jonathan was preparing his own version of the night. He arrived with a lawyer, dressed neatly, and speaking with controlled sadness. He described himself as a grieving brother who had tried to prevent a terrible argument from becoming worse. According to Jonathan, Daniel had discovered the affair and lost control. He claimed Daniel had threatened him, moved toward him aggressively, and created a situation in which Jonathan believed his own life was in danger. "I left because I was afraid," Jonathan told Mara. "I thought he might kill me too." The statement sounded convincing. Almost too convincing. Mara noticed that Jonathan never used emotional language accidentally. Every answer was precise. Every pause seemed calculated. He did not deny the affair. Instead, he presented himself as someone who had become involved with Elena only because she was unhappy and vulnerable. But the physical evidence began creating problems. Investigators examined the study, the hallway, the broken objects, and the positions of items throughout the room. The timeline Jonathan provided did not fit what they found. He claimed he had left shortly after the argument became physical. Evidence suggested otherwise. Mara requested phone records and discovered several deleted exchanges between Jonathan and Elena. Recovering them took time, but once the messages were restored, the picture became darker. Jonathan had planned to meet Elena that night. The meeting had been arranged before Daniel unexpectedly returned home. One message showed Elena asking what would happen if Daniel came back early. Jonathan's response was reassuring. He told her not to worry. Mara read the exchange twice. The problem was not simply that Jonathan had lied about the affair. He had lied about the reason he was at the house. That distinction mattered. If Jonathan had only been trying to escape an argument, why had he arranged the meeting beforehand? Why had he warned Elena about what might happen if Daniel discovered them? And why had he disappeared before police arrived? Mara began reconsidering the entire sequence. Perhaps Elena's death had not been an unpredictable result of jealousy. Perhaps the confrontation had been expected. Perhaps someone had prepared for the possibility that Daniel would discover everything. Daniel's behavior remained troubling. He had reasons to be angry, and his inability to remember certain details made him difficult to trust completely. Yet Mara had investigated enough cases to know that emotional collapse could affect memory without proving guilt. She returned to the study. Something about the room bothered her. Not the broken glass. Not the overturned furniture. Something smaller. Elena's phone. It had been recovered from the room, but investigators had initially treated it as ordinary evidence. Mara asked the technician to examine it again, including deleted files and recordings that might not appear in the usual message history. Hours later, the technician found something. A recording. It had not been sent, uploaded, or shared. It had simply remained hidden inside the phone. Mara listened through headphones. At first, there was only the sound of movement and distant voices. Then Elena spoke. Her voice sounded nervous. She asked Jonathan what they would do if Daniel discovered everything. There was a pause. Then Jonathan answered. His voice was calm. If Daniel finds out, we don't have a marriage problem anymore. We have a problem we have to solve. Mara stopped the recording. For several seconds, she said nothing. The sentence changed the investigation. Jonathan had not described a man trying to escape an unexpected confrontation. He had described a man who had already considered what would happen if Daniel discovered the affair. Mara played the recording again. This time, she listened to every pause, every breath, every movement in the background. There was something else. Just before Jonathan's final sentence, Elena asked a question that made Mara's attention sharpen. Are you sure nobody will get hurt? The recording ended there. Mara removed the headphones slowly. Until that moment, the investigation had centered on one question. Did Daniel kill Elena? Now another question became more important. What had Jonathan planned before Daniel ever walked through that door? Mara looked at the evidence spread across the table. The affair was no longer the center of the case. The hidden recording suggested something far more deliberate. And if Jonathan had been preparing for the possibility of discovery, then Elena's death might not have been the tragedy that followed the confrontation. It might have been the outcome someone had already anticipated. There was one more detail Mara could not ignore. Jonathan had left the house with almost no explanation, yet his car records showed movement inconsistent with his statement. Someone had helped him, or he had prepared another route. Mara wrote the possibility in her notebook and underlined it twice. If Jonathan had expected trouble, then his disappearance was not an accident. It was part of the plan, and someone else might know exactly where he went that night. Mara immediately ordered a deeper search of Jonathan's movements, communications, finances, and professional records. Because the next step was no longer proving that Jonathan had lied. It was discovering what he had been preparing to solve. The investigation no longer centered on Daniel. Mara Ellis had already begun looking beyond the study, beyond the affair, and beyond the carefully prepared story Jonathan had given the police. The more she searched, the more familiar Jonathan's behavior began to look. His professional history contained no obvious criminal record. There were no formal complaints that had survived long enough to become public. Yet Mara found several people who remembered encounters with him differently. A former assistant described Jonathan as unusually attentive when someone was struggling. He would listen patiently, offer advice, and make the person feel understood. Another witness remembered how quickly that sympathy became influence. Jonathan seemed to learn what people feared losing, then quietly made himself important to them. Mara spoke with former colleagues, former clients, and people who had crossed paths with Jonathan through his legal work. Their stories varied, but the structure remained strangely similar. Jonathan offered sympathy. He gained trust. He crossed a boundary so gradually that the person rarely recognized it immediately. Then he used something they had told him in confidence to keep the relationship under his control. Elena's messages suddenly fit that pattern. Technicians recovered more of her deleted conversations, including messages she had sent during the final weeks of the affair. At first, Elena sounded convinced that Jonathan understood her better than Daniel ever had. She began questioning his stories. One message asked why Jonathan had repeatedly described Daniel as dangerous when Daniel had never actually threatened her. Another revealed that Elena had spoken privately with someone who contradicted Jonathan's version of Daniel's behavior. Mara read the exchange carefully. Elena had started realizing that Jonathan had exaggerated her fear. He had told her Daniel would become violent. He had warned her that leaving him would be dangerous. He had insisted that Jonathan alone could protect her. But Elena had begun seeing the contradiction. If Daniel was truly as dangerous as Jonathan claimed, why had Jonathan repeatedly encouraged her to meet him secretly? Why had he continued provoking a situation that could supposedly become violent? And why did every warning make Elena more dependent on Jonathan? Then Mara found something more important. Elena had planned to end the relationship. Her final messages showed uncertainty rather than affection. She was frightened, confused, and beginning to regret how far everything had gone. One message stood out. "Tonight has to end something. I just don't know what." Mara stared at the sentence. The wording was ambiguous, but the surrounding messages made its meaning clearer. Elena was considering ending the affair. She wanted to confront Jonathan and force him to accept that their relationship could not continue. Jonathan, however, appeared to read the message differently. To him, Elena was not simply leaving. She was becoming a threat. If Elena told Daniel everything, Jonathan's carefully protected reputation could collapse. His professional standing could be damaged. His relationship with Daniel would be exposed as a betrayal. More importantly, the private information he had used to control Elena could become evidence against him. Mara began considering a new possibility. Jonathan might not have been afraid of losing Elena. He might have been afraid of losing control. Then Daniel provided another piece of the puzzle. During a second interview, Mara asked whether Jonathan had contacted him before the confrontation. Daniel hesitated. Then he remembered. "Yes." "What did he say?" Daniel looked uncomfortable. "He called me earlier that evening." Mara leaned forward. "Did Elena know?" Daniel shook his head. "No. Jonathan told me he wanted to talk about family matters. He asked where I was and when I would be home." Mara's expression changed. That call had not appeared in Jonathan's original account. Why would Jonathan contact Daniel before meeting Elena? The answer mattered. If Jonathan had simply been afraid of being discovered, contacting Daniel would have been reckless. But if he had been arranging the timing of the evening, the call made more sense. Perhaps Jonathan had wanted to know exactly when Daniel would return. Perhaps he had wanted to control who was in the house. Perhaps he had been testing whether Daniel knew anything already. Mara reviewed the timeline again. Jonathan arranged to meet Elena. Elena planned to end the affair. Jonathan contacted Daniel without telling Elena. Daniel returned home unexpectedly. The confrontation followed. Jonathan disappeared. Elena died. For the first time, Mara could see a possible structure behind the chaos. The affair had not simply collapsed. Someone had been trying to control how it ended. And that person had the most to lose if Elena decided to tell the truth. Mara called Daniel back into the interview room. "Did Jonathan seem surprised when you arrived?" Daniel thought about it. "No." The answer stopped Mara. "What do you mean?" Daniel swallowed. "He looked surprised that I was there, but not frightened." Mara wrote that down. Then Daniel remembered something else. "When I left the first time, Jonathan whispered something to Elena." Mara looked up immediately. "You still don't know what he said?" "No." "Did Elena react?" Daniel nodded. "She looked terrified." Mara closed her notebook. The hidden recording had already shown Jonathan speaking about solving a problem. Elena's final messages showed that she wanted something to end. Daniel's memory revealed that Jonathan had contacted him before the confrontation. All three pieces pointed in the same direction. Jonathan had been preparing for an outcome. Mara just did not know which outcome he had wanted. She returned to the recovered messages and read Elena's final sentence again. "Tonight has to end something. I just don't know what." Perhaps Elena had meant the affair. Perhaps Jonathan had believed she meant his entire carefully constructed life. Either way, the next step was clear. Mara needed to find out what Jonathan had planned before Elena ever entered the study. Because if he had prepared for her to leave, he may also have prepared for her to talk. It might be hidden somewhere Jonathan believed nobody would ever look. The possibility that Jonathan had planned the evening changed everything. What began as an investigation into a family tragedy was becoming an examination of a man who had spent years building control behind a respectable public image. Jonathan's reputation began collapsing almost immediately. Former colleagues, who had once praised his judgment, now agreed to speak with investigators. Some described incidents they had previously dismissed as uncomfortable but harmless. Others admitted that Jonathan had used private information to influence professional relationships. Nobody had enough evidence to accuse him of a crime at the time, but the pattern was impossible to ignore. Mara Ellis noticed another pattern in the financial records. Several payments connected to Jonathan had no obvious explanation. They were not large enough to attract immediate attention, but their timing mattered. Money had moved between accounts shortly before and after important conversations with people who later became witnesses. Mara ordered a closer examination. The payments led investigators to people Jonathan had contacted after Elena's death. One witness admitted that Jonathan had called and encouraged her to remember the evening differently. Another said Jonathan suggested that Daniel had been threatening for months. A third remembered being told that Jonathan had left the house before the confrontation became dangerous. The details were subtle. Jonathan never directly ordered anyone to lie. He simply reminded them of certain things. He asked leading questions. He repeated his own version until people began wondering whether their memories had been wrong. Mara recognized the technique. Jonathan was not merely defending himself. He was shaping the evidence. Meanwhile, Jonathan's legal defense became increasingly aggressive. His attorneys argued that Daniel was the only person who had been inside the house during Elena's final moments. They emphasized Daniel's jealousy, his emotional instability, and his admission that he had not intended to hurt Elena. Jonathan repeated the same message publicly. Daniel killed her. Jonathan had only tried to protect himself. The statement began appearing everywhere. Interviews repeated it. Headlines simplified it. People who knew nothing about the investigation started discussing Daniel, as though his guilt had already been established. Mara refused to let public opinion determine the case. She returned to the deleted communications. The recovered messages showed that Jonathan had known Elena was considering ending the affair. They showed that he expected Daniel might return home. They also showed that he had contacted Daniel before meeting Elena. Mara placed the evidence in front of Jonathan during another interview. He looked at the messages without speaking. "You knew Daniel might come home," Mara said. Jonathan remained silent. "You knew he was emotionally unstable." Still nothing. "You knew Elena intended to confront you." Jonathan finally looked up. Mara continued. "And knowing all of that, you went to the house anyway." The room became quiet. Jonathan's lawyer warned him not to answer. Mara waited. She did not need to raise her voice. She knew the evidence had already changed the balance of the conversation. "Why?" Jonathan stared at the table. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he leaned back and slowly exhaled. "Because I thought I could control what happened." Mara did not move. The sentence was simple, but it changed the entire case. Jonathan had finally admitted what the evidence had been suggesting. He had known the risks. He had known Daniel could return. He had known Elena was reconsidering the relationship. And despite all of that, he had entered the house. Not because he had been surprised. Not because he had accidentally become involved in a confrontation. Because he believed he could control the outcome. Mara asked what he meant. Jonathan immediately tried to qualify the statement. He said he meant controlling the conversation. He meant preventing Daniel from becoming violent. He meant protecting Elena from a situation he believed could become dangerous. But the explanation no longer carried the same weight. He had already admitted knowing what was coming. The investigation now focused on intent. Mara knew that proving Jonathan directly caused Elena's death would require more than showing that he had manipulated people. But she also knew that manipulation could explain why the confrontation happened, why Elena became trapped between two men, and why Jonathan disappeared afterward. The distinction became crucial. Daniel may have been the person physically responsible for Elena's death, but Jonathan had helped create the circumstances that made the confrontation possible. He had encouraged Elena to fear Daniel. He had encouraged Daniel to distrust Elena. He had concealed his own intentions. He had prepared witnesses. And after Elena died, he had attempted to shape the story before investigators could reconstruct it themselves. For Mara, the case was no longer about one terrible moment. It was about everything that had happened before that moment. Every conversation, every warning, every secret, every carefully chosen lie. Then investigators discovered something else. A security camera from a nearby property had captured Jonathan leaving the neighborhood after the confrontation. The timestamp contradicted another part of his statement. He had not simply fled in panic. He had stopped somewhere first. That stop lasted several minutes. Mara obtained the footage and watched it repeatedly. Jonathan's car disappeared from the camera's view, then returned to the road. Whatever he had done during those missing minutes, he had considered it important enough to risk delaying his escape. Mara requested records from the location. The answer would not arrive until the following morning. But before leaving the office, she looked again at Jonathan's statement. "I thought I could control what happened." Those words now sounded less like an explanation and more like an admission. The question was no longer whether Jonathan had manipulated the people around him. The question was what he had done during those missing minutes. And when the records arrived, Mara expected they would reveal whether Jonathan had been running from the consequences of Elena's death, or returning to complete something he had started. And whatever waited at that location could connect Jonathan to the secret Elena had discovered before her death. The records from Jonathan's unexplained stop had not arrived yet, but Detective Mara Ellis knew there was another conversation she could no longer postpone. Daniel had already given several statements, each one revealing another piece of the night. Now she needed the one thing he had avoided from the beginning, the truth about himself. Daniel sat across from her in the interrogation room, his hands resting motionless on the table. He looked different from the man who had first been questioned after Elena's death. The anger had faded. What remained was exhaustion, shame, and the realization that no explanation could return his old life. Mara opened the folder. "This is your final interview before the case moves forward," she said. "I need you to stop protecting yourself." Daniel looked at the table. "I know." For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Daniel began talking. He admitted that his jealousy had existed long before Jonathan became part of their marriage. He had always been afraid Elena would discover that she could live without him. Instead of admitting that fear, he had tried to control it. He checked her phone. He questioned her friendships. He asked where she was going and who she would meet. When Elena wanted time alone, Daniel interpreted it as rejection. When she disagreed with him, he sometimes treated independence as disloyalty. Mara listened without interrupting. Daniel said he had convinced himself that these behaviors were proof of love. He believed a husband who paid attention could prevent problems before they happened. He believed knowing everything would keep Elena from leaving. But Elena had not felt protected. She had felt watched. Daniel closed his eyes. "I know that now." Mara pushed the folder aside. "You keep saying the affair destroyed you." "It did." "It hurt you," Mara corrected. "That is not the same thing." Daniel looked up. She continued. "You are describing Elena's choices as though they erased yours. They don't. She made decisions that betrayed your marriage. You made decisions that damaged it before Jonathan ever entered the picture. Daniel's breathing became uneven. Mara did not soften her words. Elena had a right to make her own choices, even choices you hated. Daniel shook his head. She was my wife. Mara held his gaze. That doesn't mean she was your possession. The sentence broke something inside him. Daniel lowered his head and covered his face. For the first time, he stopped trying to explain why he had been jealous. He stopped describing Jonathan as the beginning of every problem. Instead, he admitted the truth he had spent years avoiding. He had been terrified of losing Elena. And because he was terrified, he had tried to control everything around her. The irony was impossible to escape. The more Daniel controlled, the more Elena withdrew. The more she withdrew, the more suspicious he became. The more suspicious he became, the more Jonathan could present himself as the person who understood her. Daniel finally understood that Jonathan had exploited a weakness that Daniel himself had helped create. But understanding it did not erase what happened next. Mara asked him about the night of the confrontation. Daniel described entering the study, seeing Elena and Jonathan together, and feeling as though his entire identity had collapsed. He said he had not simply seen an affair. He had seen the destruction of the life he believed defined him. I was her husband, he whispered. That was who I was. Mara asked what he meant. Daniel explained that for years he had measured himself through his marriage. Being Elena's husband had become connected to his pride, his security, and his sense of worth. When Jonathan entered that space, Daniel felt as though he had been erased. He admitted that he wanted control because control made him feel safe. But nothing about that night had been safe. The room became quiet. Daniel looked at the confession placed before him. He knew signing it would change everything. The murder charge would become unavoidable. There would be no returning to the life he had known. He picked up the pen. Before signing, he asked one question. Will they ever know what really happened? Mara answered carefully. We will follow the evidence. Daniel nodded. Then he signed his confession. His name appeared beneath the statement, followed by a date and time. Mara closed the folder. The legal consequences were now unavoidable. Daniel would face the murder charge, and the confession would become a central part of the prosecution's case. Yet Mara did not leave the room immediately. She knew Daniel had accepted responsibility for what he had done, but she also knew the investigation was far from finished. A confession could explain the final moment. It could not explain everything that led there. Jonathan had manipulated Elena. He had manipulated Daniel. He had attempted to influence witnesses. He had lied about his movements. And he had disappeared before police arrived. Most importantly, the hidden recording suggested that Jonathan had expected a problem and believed he could control its outcome. Mara gathered her files. Daniel looked toward the door. For the first time, he did not ask whether Elena had betrayed him. He asked what would happen to Jonathan. Mara stopped. That, she said, depends on what we find next. Outside the interrogation room, an officer was waiting with a new evidence report. The records from Jonathan's unexplained stop had finally arrived. Mara opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph of a location Daniel had never mentioned. And beneath it was a timestamp placing Jonathan there only minutes after he left the house. Mara stared at the photograph. The investigation had just entered its most dangerous stage. Because the location was not connected to Jonathan's office, his home, or Elena. It was connected to someone else. Someone who had been missing from the story until now. And if Jonathan had gone there immediately after Elena's death, Mara suspected he had not gone to hide, but to retrieve something very important. The photograph in Mara Ellis's hand led the investigation to a quiet building on the edge of the city. Jonathan had gone there for a reason. A search of the property uncovered documents, recordings, and private files that completed the picture. Jonathan had been collecting information about people for years, including Elena, Daniel, former colleagues, and others who had trusted him. Jonathan had not simply become involved with Elena. He had studied the weaknesses of the people around him, and used those weaknesses whenever they became useful. He had encouraged Elena to fear Daniel, encouraged Daniel to distrust Elena, and then positioned himself between them as the person who supposedly understood both. The legal consequences came quickly. Daniel was formally charged with Elena's murder. His confession, the evidence from the study, and the circumstances surrounding the confrontation formed the foundation of the case against him. He could no longer hide behind jealousy, grief, or betrayal. Whatever Jonathan had done, Daniel was responsible for his own actions that night. Jonathan faced a separate prosecution. Investigators presented evidence of witness manipulation, obstruction, deception, and other misconduct uncovered during the investigation. His respected career could not protect him anymore. Yet the story refused to offer a simple villain. Daniel had killed Elena. Jonathan had manipulated Elena and Daniel while hiding behind his authority. Elena had betrayed her husband, but she had also been manipulated by a man she believed could help her escape a marriage she no longer wanted. None of those truths canceled the others. Each person had made choices. Each choice created another consequence. And together, those consequences became impossible to stop. Months later, Mara returned to the house. It was a gray afternoon when she stood outside the front door, looking at the place where the investigation had begun. The house seemed smaller than she remembered. There were no officers outside, no evidence markers, no voices moving through the rooms. Inside, everything had been cleaned. The study had been restored. The broken glass was gone. The furniture had been returned to its original position. Even the stains that once marked the floor had disappeared. But Mara knew that cleaning a room could not erase what had happened there. She walked slowly through the hallway. She remembered Daniel standing near the study door, Elena unable to answer his question, and Jonathan trying to control the conversation even after everything had been exposed. The house was silent now. That silence felt heavier than the noise had. Daniel's marriage was gone. Jonathan's reputation was destroyed. Elena was dead. Daniel would spend years facing the consequences of one moment that had been built from countless earlier choices. Jonathan would live with the consequences of believing that intelligence and authority gave him the right to control other people's lives. Elena's final decisions could never be separated completely from the pressure, fear, and manipulation surrounding her. Mara stopped in the study. She looked at the empty desk. Once, Jonathan's watch had rested there beside Elena's wedding ring. That image had become one of the strongest memories in the case. Now there was nothing. Just an empty surface. Mara understood that the murder had not really begun when Daniel lost control. It had begun much earlier. It began with secrets that seemed harmless. It grew through resentment that nobody addressed. It deepened through manipulation disguised as concern. It survived because Elena became emotionally isolated, Daniel became increasingly controlling, and Jonathan learned how to turn both weaknesses against them. Most importantly, it grew from a dangerous belief that love gives one person ownership over another. Daniel had believed that controlling Elena could keep her from leaving. Jonathan had believed that understanding Elena's fears gave him power over her choices. Both beliefs were destructive. Neither was love. The final months of the investigation had taught Mara that crimes were rarely created by one decision alone. Sometimes, the final act was only the visible end of a much longer chain. That chain could begin with a lie, then another, then a secret, then a compromise, then a choice that seemed small enough to survive. Until, eventually, there were no small choices left. In prison, Daniel had little control over his surroundings. He spent long periods in silence, thinking about the woman he had married and the brother he had trusted. One afternoon, Daniel sat at a small table with a blank sheet of paper. He held a pen. For several minutes, he did nothing. Then he wrote Elena's name. The name carried everything he had lost. His marriage, his family, his future, his certainty about himself. Daniel almost crossed the name out. Instead, he placed the pen beneath it and wrote a second sentence. She didn't belong to me. He read the words again. They felt like a truth he should have understood years earlier. He finally understood that losing Elena had never given him the right to control her life, choices, or future or her freedom. Back at the house, Mara stood by the window and looked toward the empty street. She thought about the night Elena died and the question everyone had asked afterward. Who was to blame? Daniel wanted Jonathan to be responsible. Jonathan wanted Daniel to carry everything. Elena had wanted someone to save her from a marriage she believed had become unbearable. But the truth was harder. There was no single moment that explained everything. There were hundreds of choices. Hundreds of small decisions that created distance, fear, secrecy, dependence, anger, and finally violence. Mara closed her notebook. The investigation was over. The consequences were not. Some rooms could be cleaned. Some reputations could be destroyed. Some sentences could be handed down. But the choices that led to Elena's death would remain. And that was the lesson Mara carried with her when she finally walked away from the house. The night Elena died, everyone wanted someone else to blame. But the truth was harder. There wasn't one moment that caused the murder. There were hundreds of choices that led to it.